3 days, 72 hours, more than 20 of the enemy's finest snipers lay motionless in the snow, waiting for a single woman who did not exist on any military record. They believed that the moment she raised her head, the war would end on their terms. But when the first shot finally cracked through the blizzard, nobody understood where the bullet had come from. 8 seconds later, the entire forward command post collapsed into chaos. One cold bore shot, fired from 5,002 meters away, rewrote the outcome of a war that had already claimed too many lives. The winter that year was not an ordinary winter. The mountains along the border had been buried under snow since the first week of the season, and the wind never seemed to rest, gusting past 60 kilometers an hour and turning every open ridge into a wall of white. Visibility changed by the minute. One moment a soldier could see clear across a valley, and the next he could not see his own boots. The war had dragged on for months, and both sides were running out of everything except stubbornness. Supply lines froze. Radios crackled with static instead of orders. Men on both sides had learned to measure time not in days but in the number of comrades they had buried. In a command bunker carved into the eastern ridge, a woman studied a topographic map by the light of a single lantern. Her name was Evelyn Ross, 35 years old, and she did not appear in any personnel file that outsiders were allowed to see. There was no photograph of her circulating among the ranks, no service number listed in the general database, nothing that connected her face to her function. Only a small circle of senior officers knew who she truly was, and even they spoke of her in careful, indirect language, as though naming her too plainly might somehow break the spell that kept her alive. Down on the valley floor, the war looked nothing like strategy. It looked like exhaustion. Snow covered the trenches faster than the soldiers could clear them. Both armies had dug in along a ridgeline that neither could fully hold, trading small hills back and forth at a staggering cost. Casualty reports arrived every morning listing hundreds of names, and every evening the numbers grew instead of shrinking. Commanders on both sides had started to understand that this war would not be won by artillery or by numbers alone. It would be won, or lost, in the smallest and quietest moments. The enemy had been losing something else entirely, something harder to replace than soldiers. Over the previous months, a string of senior officers had died in ways that defied explanation. A colonel struck down while reviewing maps behind 3 walls of sandbags. A radio operator killed through a gap in a bunker no wider than a fist. A convoy commander shot through the windshield of an armored vehicle moving at speed. Each time, investigators found nothing. No footprints close enough to matter, no muzzle flash reported by observers, no shell casing left behind for forensics to study. Rumors began to spread through the enemy ranks like frost creeping across a window. Soldiers whispered a name that had no official record attached to it. They called her the Ghost Woman, and they said she had returned. Some claimed she could not be killed because she was never truly present, only a shadow that borrowed the wind. Officers dismissed the stories as superstition born of fear and fatigue, yet privately, many of them began sleeping farther from windows and doorways than they used to. Colonel Viktor Sokolov did not believe in ghosts, but he believed in patterns, and the pattern in front of him was unmistakable. He gathered his best intelligence officers in a heated tent and laid out every incident on a single map, connecting the locations with red string until the picture became impossible to ignore. Each kill had come from an angle that should have been impossible, at a range that defied every rule of infantry combat. Sokolov understood something his younger officers did not yet grasp. If this woman remained alive, his side would eventually lose the war, not through lack of soldiers, but through the slow unraveling of leadership itself. He made his decision that same night. Every available marksman, more than 20 of the finest shooters his army possessed, would be pulled from the front and repositioned along the ridge where the last 3 killings had occurred. Unmanned aircraft would patrol the sky in overlapping circles. Ground sensors capable of detecting the faintest seismic tremor would be buried beneath the snow. Thermal imaging units would scan every slope through the night. Nobody would fire without direct authorization. This would not be a battle. It would be a siege, built entirely around the patience required to outlast one person. For 3 full days, nothing moved. The snipers lay wrapped in white cloth, their body heat masked by thermal blankets. Their breathing slowed to the rhythm their training had beaten into them over years. Officers rotated shifts inside heated tents nearby, watching monitors that showed nothing but static shapes of drifting snow. Sokolov himself barely slept, pacing between the surveillance tent and the radio room, demanding updates every hour even when there was nothing new to report. The waiting wore on the men more than any firefight could have, because an enemy who does not appear cannot be fought, only feared. On the other side of the ridge, nobody could say where Evelyn actually was. She had left the bunker 3 nights earlier with nothing more than a small sled loaded with equipment, and she had not communicated with headquarters since. No radio, no scheduled check-in, no coordinates transmitted for her own safety. Her commanding general had approved the silence himself, understanding that any signal she sent could be intercepted and used to end her life. All they could do now was trust the years of preparation that had brought her to this point, and wait, just as her enemies waited, for the storm to decide who moved first. On the 3rd night, a thermal camera near the western slope caught a flicker it could not immediately classify. A shape passed briefly across the lens, low and slow, wrapped in white fabric that blended almost perfectly with the drifting snow. The operator flagged the footage and sent it up the chain within minutes. By the time an analyst reviewed the frame closely enough to be certain it was human, the figure was already gone, swallowed back into the storm as though it had never been there at all. Evelyn appeared for the first time 3 days into her journey, and she appeared exactly as her training had taught her to. She did not walk with the tension of a hunted animal. She did not glance nervously over her shoulder or move faster than the terrain allowed. She simply moved, one careful step after another, pulling her small sled behind her across a slope steep enough to break an ankle if she misjudged the ice beneath the powder. Inside the sled were only the essentials: a rifle wrapped tightly against the moisture, ammunition sealed in waterproof cases, and enough rations to keep her functioning through the coldest stretch of the mission. She said nothing, because there was nobody to say anything to. She carried no radio, because a radio could be intercepted, triangulated, and turned into a death sentence within minutes. Every choice she made had been stripped down to the essentials required for survival and for the mission that survival served. Watching her move, a person unfamiliar with her history might have mistaken her calm for recklessness. In truth, it was the opposite. Nothing about her path across that mountain was accidental. She avoided every drone that passed overhead, not through luck, but through an understanding of physics that had taken her years to master. She knew how wind behaved when it funneled through a mountain pass, how it created pockets of turbulence that pushed small aircraft off their intended course for just long enough to matter. She knew which slopes held snow that would betray her footsteps with a telltale crunch, and which slopes stayed soft enough to swallow sound. She had studied this terrain from satellite images for months, before ever setting foot on it, memorizing ridgelines and drainage patterns the way other soldiers memorized rifle specifications. Anyone paying close attention to her movements would have begun to understand something important. This was not a woman improvising her way through danger. This was a woman executing a plan that had been built over years, refined through countless failures nobody had witnessed, and rehearsed so thoroughly that her body now moved through the cold with an economy that looked almost effortless. Every pause she took to check the wind, every shift in her route to avoid open ground, was the product of preparation invisible to anyone who had not lived through the training that shaped her. The cold itself was an enemy she had learned to negotiate with rather than fight. At 32 degrees below zero, exposed skin could freeze within minutes, and exhaustion could kill just as efficiently as any bullet if she allowed her body temperature to slip even a few degrees too far. She rationed her energy the way a miser rationed coin, moving in careful bursts followed by stillness, never allowing her muscles to burn hot enough to sweat, because sweat froze against the skin and stole warmth far faster than dry cold ever could. Every hour, she checked her fingers and toes for the first pale warning signs of frostbite, flexing them inside thick gloves and boots that had been fitted to her feet with an obsessive precision most soldiers never bothered with. She ate sparingly from the rations packed on her sled, small measured portions of dense, calorie-heavy food designed to keep her core temperature stable without slowing her down. She melted snow for water using the heat of her own body rather than risking a fire that might betray her position to a thermal sensor circling somewhere above the clouds. Sleep, when she allowed herself any, came in short fragments taken inside a shallow trench she carved from packed snow, insulated enough to trap what little warmth her body produced. She never slept for more than an hour at a time, waking herself before her body could sink into the kind of deep rest that made a person slow to react. The terrain itself demanded a different kind of vigilance. Beneath the fresh powder, hidden layers of ice waited to betray an unsteady foot, and crevasses along the northern slope could swallow a careless step without warning. She tested the ground ahead of her with a slender pole before committing her weight to it, a habit drilled into her so deeply that she performed it without conscious thought. When the wind screamed loudest, she used the noise as cover, closing distance across open stretches while the storm masked both her movement and the faint sound of her boots against the snow. Near the end of that 3rd day, one of the enemy's finest marksmen finally caught a glimpse of movement through his scope, a pale shape crossing a gap between two ridgelines nearly a full kilometer away. His hands tightened around his rifle, and his breathing slowed the way years of discipline had taught him. He raised his weapon, adjusted for the wind, and waited for the shape to reappear in his sights. When it did not, he assumed the storm had simply obscured his view. He never learned that the figure he had seen was already gone, folded into a fold of rock that existed on no map he had ever studied. The disappearance of that first sniper went unnoticed for nearly 6 hours, because nobody expected silence to mean danger. His scheduled check-in simply did not arrive, and the officer monitoring the network assumed a radio malfunction, a common enough problem in weather this severe. It was not until the second sniper failed to respond that anyone began to feel the first cold prickle of alarm. There had been no gunfire. There had been no signal of distress. There had simply been 2 men, and then there were none. By the time a third position went silent, panic had begun to spread through the ranks in a way that no amount of discipline could fully contain. Officers who had spent their careers trusting logic and firepower found themselves facing something that obeyed neither. Nobody could say with certainty who was hunting whom anymore. The men who had been sent to lie in wait for a single target now found themselves wondering whether they themselves had become the prey, picked off one by one in a game whose rules only their opponent understood. Sokolov refused to allow the fear to spread further without answers. He ordered every remaining position reinforced, doubling up snipers in pairs so that no man would be left alone in his hide. He pushed drone patrols closer together, tightening the surveillance grid until barely a square meter of the slope went unwatched for more than a few seconds. Still, the silence from the missing positions offered no clues. No bodies were recovered. No blood was found in the snow near their last known coordinates. It was as though the mountain itself had simply decided to erase them. Through all of this, Evelyn had not fired a single shot. She had eliminated 3 trained marksmen using nothing but timing, terrain, and the element of surprise, closing the distance in silence and ending each threat before it ever became aware of her presence. But these men were never her true objective. They were obstacles. Dangerous ones, but obstacles nonetheless, standing between her and the target that mattered. She continued to move through the storm with the same unhurried patience, scanning the ridge for the one position that would let her see what she had truly come for. What she was searching for was not a person, but a vantage point, a single location on the mountain that offered a direct, unbroken line toward the enemy's forward command post, nearly 5 kilometers away. Most soldiers would have called such a distance unreachable, a fantasy better suited to films than to the reality of ballistics and physics. Evelyn had spent years proving otherwise, not through belief, but through calculation, testing, and the accumulation of thousands of hours spent understanding exactly how a bullet behaved once it left a barrel and entered a world governed by forces most people never bothered to consider. Late on the third night, a drone operator watching a live feed noticed something unusual near a rocky outcrop far from any of the known sniper positions. A shape had assembled what looked like an oversized weapon system, far longer than any standard-issue rifle, mounted on a low tripod half buried in snow for stability. The operator zoomed in, as far as the camera allowed, but the storm scattered the image into blurred fragments of white and gray. He flagged the footage immediately and sent it up the chain, but by the time an analyst reviewed it with any clarity, the moment had already passed into history. The weapon Evelyn had assembled was the product of years of development that few people outside a small circle of engineers and marksmen had ever witnessed. It was not a standard rifle modified for the occasion. It had been built specifically to answer a single question that most experts considered theoretical at best. A question about how far a bullet could realistically travel and still strike a target with lethal precision. Every component, from the barrel length to the propellant formula, had been engineered around distances that conventional military doctrine treated as fantasy. 5,002 meters. When the number first appeared in planning documents years earlier, senior ballistics experts had called it impossible, a theoretical exercise with no practical application on any real battlefield. Wind alone would scatter a bullet across such a distance long before it reached anything resembling a target. Gravity would pull it into an arc so extreme that timing the shot would require calculations beyond what any human mind could reasonably perform under combat conditions. Yet Evelyn had spent years proving that impossible was simply a word people used when they had not yet done the work required to make something possible. While she prepared her position on the ridge, 5 kilometers away, Colonel Sokolov had gathered his senior staff inside the forward command post for an emergency meeting. The missing snipers demanded an explanation, and he intended to reorganize the entire operation before another position went silent. Generals, intelligence officers, and communications specialists crowded around a long table beneath reinforced concrete, believing themselves protected by walls thick enough to withstand direct artillery fire. Nobody in that room imagined that distance itself could no longer guarantee their safety. None of them understood that Evelyn had already selected this exact meeting as her target, not through luck, but through months of intelligence gathering that had mapped the command post's routines with disturbing precision. She knew when senior officers gathered, how long such meetings typically lasted, and which window offered the only unobstructed line of sight across the entire valley. She had waited 3 days in brutal cold, eliminating threats one by one, not out of aggression, but because every hour that passed brought her closer to the exact moment when the maximum number of decision-makers would be gathered behind that single pane of reinforced glass. She settled into her final position with the deliberate calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment more times than she could count, though never under conditions quite this severe. The wind howled across the ridge at speeds that would have made most marksmen abandon the shot entirely. But Evelyn had trained specifically for conditions like these, understanding that the wars that mattered most were rarely fought in comfortable weather. She lowered herself behind the weapon, adjusted the bipod for the uneven rock beneath her, and began the long, silent process of loading the first round into the chamber. There was no dialogue in this moment, because there was nobody left to speak to. There was only her breath, slow and controlled, fogging briefly in the freezing air before dissolving into the wind. There was the storm itself, relentless and indifferent, howling across the exposed ridge, as though trying to tear the rifle from her hands. There was the distant, steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, which she had trained for years to slow through sheer force of discipline whenever the moment demanded absolute stillness. She began the calculations that separated an impossible shot from a merely difficult one, running through variables that most people would never think to consider. Temperature affected the density of the air the bullet would travel through, and the temperature here sat at a brutal 32 degrees below zero. Altitude changed atmospheric pressure in ways that shifted the bullet's trajectory by fractions that mattered at this distance. The rotation of the Earth itself, the Coriolis effect that most shooters never needed to account for at ordinary ranges, became a critical factor once the bullet's flight time stretched into multiple seconds. Wind was the most dangerous variable of all, because it did not behave uniformly across 5 kilometers of open terrain. Near the ground, gusts howled at speeds that shifted direction almost randomly, funneled by the shape of the valley below. Higher above, where the bullet would spend most of its flight, the wind moved differently, steadier, but still unpredictable in ways that could scatter a shot by meters if miscalculated. Evelyn had spent years building a mental model of how wind layered itself across terrain like this, and now she trusted that model with a certainty most people reserved for simple arithmetic. She made her final adjustments to the scope, dialing in corrections built from calculations that had taken her the better part of an hour to complete, refined and rechecked twice more before she allowed herself to commit. Her fingers settled against the trigger with a lightness that belied the enormous weight of the decision behind it. She exhaled slowly, allowing her body to reach the natural pause between heartbeats that every marksman learns to find, the fraction of a second when the human body achieves something close to true stillness. She pulled the trigger. The bullet left the barrel at a velocity that would have been meaningless to anyone who had not studied exactly what happened next. It climbed through the freezing air in an arc invisible to the naked eye, rising higher than most people would ever imagine a bullet traveling before beginning its long, curving descent toward a target it would not reach for several full seconds, an eternity by the standards of modern combat. Snow swirled around the muzzle as the shockwave dispersed, and then the mountain fell silent again, as though nothing at all had happened. The bullet's journey across those 5 kilometers unfolded in a way that no camera could have captured and no witness could have followed with the naked eye. It climbed through layers of wind that shifted its path by fractions of a degree, corrections that Evelyn's calculations had already anticipated and accounted for. It crossed above valleys where the temperature dropped further still, and above ridgelines where updrafts threatened to push it off course entirely. Every meter of that flight represented a variable that could have ended the shot in failure, and every meter passed exactly as she had calculated. In the first heartbeat after the shot left the barrel, the round was already rising above the ridge where she lay, climbing into air so cold it seemed to slow sound itself. In the second heartbeat, it crossed above a frozen riverbed where 2 of the missing snipers had once held their positions, the wind there gusting sideways in exactly the pattern she had predicted from months of studying the valley's shape. In the third heartbeat, it passed above a stand of skeletal trees bent permanently sideways by decades of prevailing wind, trees she had used as a reference point during her final calculations the night before. By the fourth heartbeat, the bullet had begun its long, curving descent, gravity finally asserting its claim after the initial force of the shot had carried it higher than most marksmen would ever dare to aim. In the fifth heartbeat, it crossed above the outer perimeter of the enemy compound, passing near enough to a drone patrol that the aircraft's onboard sensors registered a brief anomaly nobody would review until it was already too late to matter. In the sixth heartbeat, it dropped lower still, cutting through the last open stretch of air above the valley floor, closing the final distance toward the compound's reinforced windows. In the seventh heartbeat, snow flurries parted briefly around its path, as though the storm itself had chosen that instant to grant a narrow, invisible corridor. And in the eighth heartbeat, the round reached the end of its 5,002-meter journey, arriving at the exact coordinate Evelyn had committed to memory hours earlier, striking with a velocity that had barely diminished despite the extraordinary distance it had traveled. 8 seconds, from trigger to impact, was all it took to end a standoff that had consumed 3 days, 20 lives, and months of grinding stalemate. Inside the forward command post, the meeting continued exactly as it had for the previous 20 minutes, officers arguing over maps and casualty projections, unaware that anything beyond their walls had changed. Sokolov stood near the head of the table, pointing toward a section of the ridge where he intended to reposition his remaining snipers, his voice raised slightly to be heard over the wind battering the reinforced windows. Nobody in that room could have imagined that the wind they heard outside was, at that very moment, carrying something toward them that no wall had ever been designed to stop. The bullet struck the reinforced window at almost the exact center of the pane, a piece of glass engineered to withstand small arms fire and shrapnel from nearby explosions, never designed with a threat like this in mind. The glass shattered inward in a spray of fragments, and the round continued forward with enough remaining energy to strike its intended target before anyone in the room had even processed the sound of the impact. By the time the first officer reacted, the moment that would define the rest of the war had already passed. What followed happened faster than anyone inside that command post could fully comprehend. Within seconds, the loss of the room's most senior officer triggered a cascade of confusion that spread through the entire compound. Somewhere nearby, a fuel depot that had been positioned dangerously close to the command post ignited in a secondary explosion, the exact cause of which would remain debated for years afterward. Communication lines running through the building went dark almost simultaneously, severing contact between the forward post and every unit that depended on it for coordination. Radar systems that had been tracking movement across the ridge for 3 straight days flickered and died within minutes, whether from the explosion or from the sheer confusion of operators who no longer had commanders to report to. The entire command structure that had spent 72 hours patiently waiting to eliminate a single woman collapsed in less time than it took most people to finish a cup of coffee. Nobody in that compound understood what had happened. They only understood that everything they had built their strategy around had suddenly ceased to function. Junior officers who had never been trained to operate without direct orders found themselves paralyzed, unsure whether to evacuate the compound, defend it, or wait for instructions that would never come from a chain of command that no longer functioned. Some ran toward the burning fuel depot to help contain the fire, only to be turned back by secondary explosions that made the entire area impassable. Others tried desperately to re-establish contact with outlying units, shouting into radios that returned nothing but static, unaware that the antenna array feeding their entire communications network had been severed in the same chaotic minutes that claimed their commanders. For the first time since the war began, an army that had prided itself on discipline and coordination found itself reduced to individual men making individual decisions, with no larger structure left to guide them. In the chaos that followed, not a single officer could explain where the shot had originated. Investigators would spend weeks combing the surrounding ridgelines for evidence, searching for a position close enough to explain what they had witnessed, because nothing in their training had prepared them to consider a distance this extreme as a realistic possibility. All they knew, in the end, was something simpler and far more unsettling than any technical explanation could provide. The direction of the war itself had changed in the span of 8 seconds, and nothing they did afterward would ever fully reverse it. News of what had happened spread through both armies within hours, though the details shifted and distorted with every retelling, as stories about impossible events always do. Enemy soldiers who had spent 3 days lying in the snow, waiting for a target that never appeared to them directly, now found themselves haunted by a name they barely understood. They called her the Ghost Woman, not because they believed in the supernatural, but because no rational explanation for what she had done seemed sufficient anymore. The enemy command, humiliated and desperate to reclaim some sense of control, launched an enormous campaign to hunt her down. Aircraft crossed the mountain range in patterns designed to cover every inch of terrain within 100 kilometers. Additional drones swept the valleys at all hours, their thermal cameras scanning for any trace of human heat against the frozen landscape. Elite Special Forces units were deployed on foot, tracking dogs straining against their leashes as handlers pushed them through snowdrifts in search of a scent that had already been erased by the storm. None of it worked. Evelyn had vanished from the ridge the same night she fired her shot, retreating along a route she had memorized months earlier, one that avoided every valley wide enough for aircraft to search efficiently. She moved only at night, resting during daylight hours in shelters carved from snow and stone that left almost no trace once she departed. By the time search teams reached the position where the shot had originated, there was nothing left to find except a shallow depression in the snow and a single spent casing that had somehow been overlooked in the chaos of her departure. The search parties that came closest to finding her never realized how close they truly were. On one occasion, a patrol passed within a few hundred meters of the snow shelter where she lay resting, their voices carrying faintly through the wind as they debated which direction to search next. She remained motionless beneath a thin layer of packed snow, her breathing slowed to the same controlled rhythm she used before every shot, until the voices faded and the crunch of their boots disappeared back into the storm. Tracking dogs lost her scent repeatedly, confused by a trail that crossed frozen streams and doubled back across its own path in patterns she had planned specifically to defeat exactly this kind of pursuit. After nearly 2 weeks of fruitless searching, exhausted and demoralized, the hunting parties were recalled, and the enemy command quietly accepted what its soldiers had already begun to whisper among themselves. The ghost woman could not be caught, because she had never truly been where anyone expected her to be. Meanwhile, on the other side of the front, the effect of that single shot rippled through the entire war in ways that no strategist could have fully predicted. With their forward command structure shattered and their most experienced officers gone, the enemy's coordination collapsed at a critical moment. Allied forces, sensing the shift immediately, pressed forward along lines that had been static for months, gaining ground that had previously cost hundreds of lives for every 100 meters. Morale among exhausted troops surged overnight, fueled by rumors of the impossible shot that had ended the standoff on the ridge. Weeks later, in a quiet outpost far from the front, a young soldier walking a routine patrol noticed something small and metallic half buried in the snow near an old firing position. He knelt down and brushed away the frost to find a single brass casing, its markings worn but still legible enough to identify. He turned it over in his gloved hand for a long moment, understanding somehow, even without being told, that he was holding a piece of the story that had already begun spreading through every unit on his side of the line. In the months following the end of active combat, military analysts and historians began the long process of trying to understand exactly what had happened on that ridge. Ballistics experts pored over the available data, running simulations meant to explain how a single shot could travel such an extraordinary distance and still strike its target with lethal accuracy. Many of them concluded that the numbers simply should not have worked, that too many variables should have combined to push the round off course long before it ever reached the command post. Some among them chose the easiest explanation available, insisting that pure chance had carried the day, that even the most improbable outcomes occasionally occurred given enough attempts. They pointed to the sheer difficulty of the conditions. The storm, the extreme cold, the distance that defied conventional doctrine, as evidence that no amount of skill could have reliably produced such a result. It was easier, perhaps, to attribute the outcome to luck than to accept that a single person had trained herself to a level of precision that most professionals considered theoretically impossible. An older commander who had overseen Evelyn's development from her earliest days in service knew better than to accept such a simple explanation. He had watched her train for years before the war even began, long before anyone imagined she would need to fire a shot of this magnitude under conditions this extreme. He understood that what others called luck was, in reality, the product of 2 decades spent mastering a craft that demanded more patience than most people possessed in an entire lifetime. He remembered the tens of thousands of rounds she had fired during training exercises long before the war started, each one analyzed, each miss studied more carefully than each success, because failure taught lessons that comfort never could. He remembered the countless hours she had spent simply watching wind move across open terrain, learning to read its patterns the way other people read written language, until she could predict its behavior almost instinctively. What others called an impossible shot, he understood as the natural conclusion of extraordinary, almost unimaginable dedication. He recalled the early years of her training, long before anyone believed she would ever be trusted with a weapon capable of reaching the distances she would one day master. She had spent entire seasons doing nothing but observing, sitting motionless on remote hillsides with nothing but a notebook and a pair of binoculars, recording how grass bent under different wind speeds, how snow drifted differently across north-facing slopes than south-facing ones, how temperature shifts at dawn changed the density of the air just enough to matter at extreme range. Her instructors at the time had questioned whether such patience served any purpose at all. Years later, on that ridge in the storm, every one of those quiet, uneventful afternoons had paid for themselves many times over. He also remembered how many times she had failed during live trials of the extended-range weapon system, missing targets by margins that would have ended most careers in frustration and reassignment. She had never allowed a single miss to discourage her. Instead, she treated each failed shot as a data point, refining her understanding of a variable she had misjudged, adjusting her formulas by fractions so small that other observers could barely detect the change. Over years, those fractional corrections accumulated into a level of mastery that no textbook could teach and no simulation could fully replicate, because the real mountain never behaved exactly the way a controlled range did. When the official investigation into the shot eventually closed, its final report offered no definitive technical explanation, citing what it called an extraordinary convergence of favorable conditions alongside exceptional marksmanship. Few outside the small circle who had trained her ever learned the full truth, that there had been no convergence of luck at all, only the culmination of 2 decades spent turning an impossible number into a number she trusted completely. The report was filed away in an archive few people would ever open again, one more sealed document in a war already fading from public memory. The war finally ended not long after that winter, the ceasefire negotiations moving faster than anyone had expected once the enemy's command structure had been so thoroughly disrupted. Generals from both sides gathered for the formal signing, and in the aftermath, celebrations broke out across Allied territory as soldiers who had spent months bracing for endless conflict allowed themselves, finally, to imagine a future beyond the war. Newspapers ran headlines praising the strategic brilliance of commanders who had guided the final campaign to victory. Yet in all the official accounts, in all the ceremonies and speeches that followed, nobody spoke Evelyn's name. There was no medal ceremony held in her honor, no public announcement crediting her with the shot that had reshaped the final months of the war. Her role remained sealed within classified files that few people would ever be permitted to read, her identity protected as carefully in peace as it had been protected in combat. She had never sought recognition, and in the end, she received exactly the silence her work demanded. She left the base quietly on a gray morning not long after the ceasefire was signed, carrying nothing more than a single duffel bag over one shoulder. There was no formal farewell, no gathered crowd, no photographs taken to mark the occasion. She simply walked out through the gate and into the surrounding forest, where snow still clung to the branches despite the arrival of a fragile early spring. Her boots left a quiet trail behind her, one that would disappear within hours once the wind picked up again. A young journalist, having heard fragments of the story that had already begun circulating in whispered form among soldiers, managed to track her down before she disappeared entirely from public reach. He found her near the edge of the forest, pausing briefly to adjust the strap on her bag, and he asked her the question that had been building in his mind since he first heard rumors of the shot that ended the standoff on the ridge. He asked her what had kept her out there in that brutal cold for so many days, waiting for a moment that might never have come. Evelyn paused for a long moment before answering, studying the tree line ahead of her as though weighing how much of the truth a stranger deserved to hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, without pride and without bitterness, simply stating something she had clearly turned over in her own mind many times before. She told him that if one carefully placed shot could spare thousands of people from ever having to fire another, then the wait, however long, however brutal, had always been worth it. She offered no further explanation, no dramatic account of the 72 hours she had spent evading trained killers in a blizzard, no description of the calculations that had made an impossible shot possible. She simply turned and continued walking, disappearing gradually into the falling snow until even her outline became indistinguishable from the white world around her. The journalist stood watching long after she had vanished from sight, understanding that he had just witnessed the closing chapter of a story most people would never fully know. There was no parade held in her honor, no monument built to commemorate what she had done, no medal pinned to her chest before a crowd of grateful citizens. There was only the quiet, growing legend that spread slowly through military circles in the years that followed. a story told in hushed tones among soldiers who had served near that ridge during those final days of the war. They spoke of a woman who had once made more than 20 enemy snipers wait 72 hours in brutal cold, only to end an entire war with a single, cold-bore shot fired across 5,002 meters of empty, howling air. Years later, instructors at advanced marksmanship schools would still reference that shot when teaching the outer limits of what a trained human being could accomplish under the harshest possible conditions. They rarely used her real name, partly out of respect for the secrecy that had defined her service, and partly because the story had already taken on a life larger than any single person could fully embody. Students would ask whether the tale was true, whether anyone could really account for wind and temperature and distance with that degree of precision, and the instructors would simply nod and tell them that some things were true whether or not anyone chose to believe them. Somewhere far from any battlefield, in a small house at the edge of a quiet town, Evelyn Ross lived the kind of ordinary life that few people would ever associate with the legend that bore her unofficial name. She rarely spoke of the war, and those who knew her in her later years understood almost nothing of what she had once accomplished on that mountain ridge. She had wanted it that way from the beginning, understanding better than most that some victories were never meant to be celebrated loudly, only remembered quietly, by the people fortunate enough to have survived because of them. The wind still moved across that ridge every winter, exactly as it always had, indifferent to the history that had unfolded there. Snow still gathered in the same drifts, filled the same hollows, buried the same stretch of rock where a woman had once lain motionless for 3 days, waiting for a single moment that would matter more than any other in her life. Nobody who crossed that terrain in the years that followed would ever know exactly where she had knelt, exactly where she had calculated wind and cold and distance, into a shot that no textbook had ever described as achievable. The mountain kept its secret, the way it always had, and the story of the ghost woman who ended a war in 8 seconds continued to travel from soldier to soldier, growing quieter with each retelling until it settled finally into legend.